Hawksology is back, ladies and gentlemen, and oh man, do we have a lot to discuss, including the breaking news this week that the Hawks have officially dismissed Nate McMillan from his position at head coach. Another big rumble in the organization. The Hawks currently sit 8th in the East, 29-30, which is definitely below the preseason expectations when it comes to just the level of talent that's actually on this roster. There's 23 games left as Joe Prunty takes over as the interim head coach, leaving us to ask, was the firing of Nate McMillan the right move, and can the Atlanta Hawks make one last push for the playoffs? Let's start with the fact that the Hawks are tied for having the second toughest remaining schedule in the league, just coming back from the All-Star break into a 4-game homestand. Cleveland and Brooklyn up first this weekend. But obviously, with the Nate McMillan firing, the front office was not happy with the Hawks' performance up until this point and felt the need to administer this change after reportedly urging McMillan to stay on after he suggested stepping down earlier in the season. To sum up what Landry Fields said in his press conference is that based on his pulse of the team, it was time for a change. Regarding the level of talent on the roster, he straight up said the record is not acceptable, and that one thing considered in making this decision was the players' level of responsiveness to Nate's voice. That's something that goes both ways, though, and I commend the players since they've handled this respectfully and taken accountability. But at the same time, think about all the frustrations with Nate McMillan's system that there have been since he was hired full-time. You look at how John Collins essentially has gotten phased out of the offense in the past couple years. Jalen Johnson barely saw any consistent playing time for the first 2 years of his careers. Even going back to last season when DeLon Wright was barely in the rotation and even taken out of it at one point, and then in the end he ended up being one of our most impactful players. And I'll also throw out how it got overlooked that the Hawks reportedly were not prepared going into Game 1 of the playoffs last year against the Heat. But yeah, after having the second-ranked offense in terms of offensive rating last season, the Hawks have fallen all the way to 16th over the course of this season, and with McMillan being dismissed, a lot of the inconsistencies could be eliminated. From what we've seen with this era of Hawks basketball, moves like this tend to be sparks for a run. And so even the increased level of competitiveness or sense of urgency is going to be a huge factor into the Hawks' performance for the remaining 23 games. For those who saw the last 2 games before the All-Star break against the Knicks and Hornets, I'd be largely surprised to see any performances like that in these 23 games that just had that lack of intensity. But overall, there's some trends that hint at how Nate McMillan was not entirely successful at on a game-by-game basis at ensuring that the players had a thorough understanding of the game plan or complete mental and physical preparedness as they came into the game. And it's these splits right here that show you stuff would go down in the locker room at halftime, and something likely the level of energy on the court would finally click to where it should be. And so that's what's indicated by these splits, which span back to the beginning of January 2023, that the Hawks would just look like a completely different team in the third quarters of games. They were the only quarters in which the Hawks had an overall positive net rating. And you can go onto the NBA stats website and to find all the stat categories for these splits, but it's also something confirmed by the eye test. When you watched Hawks games, it was always the third quarters where they seemed to make their big run, the big push, and just beginning to execute better with everything than they did in the first half, and oftentimes that would go until the fourth quarter. Now, speaking of fourth quarters, this takes us to another trend that I noticed going right back to before the Hawks fired Lloyd Pierce, and there's an odd similarity in how the Hawks not only struggled to close out games in those fourth quarters, but also just had a random massive decline in three-point shooting. And of course, a complete lack of a sense of urgency, often looking utterly deteriorated on defense, and both coaches have had to address containment issues and this energy level, I guess, in press conferences post-game, following the team's failure to establish like a defensive presence or match the physicality of the opponent. And it's almost like you can tell when the players have lost faith in the system that they're playing in. In regards to that shooting decline, the Hawks shot 26% from three in Lloyd Pierce's last couple of games. And if you think that's bad, flash forward to the last 7 games this season before the All-Star break, and you're looking at a 31.7 clip from beyond the arc. However, the real issue is actually on open threes, meaning the closest defender is between 4 and 6 feet away. The Hawks only shot 33%, and on wide open threes, meaning there was no defender within 6 feet of the shooter, the Hawks shot 29%. Yikes. But once again, sudden changes tend to fire up the players, restore the intensity. So when we talk about execution, that intensity not only leads to getting stops and easy buckets and transition, but also creates better offense in the half court. And we'll get to that half court offense in just a second, but we can't talk about fired up players without mentioning that Trae Young was not selected as an All-Star this year. So I expect him to be playing with that prove him wrong chip on his shoulder, though in a bit of a different sense than we've seen earlier on in his career. Like, we've seen him really take the ball into his own hands and lead the team with 30-point, double-digit assist games. Obviously, that was a big part of the Eastern Conference Finals run, but his expectation of being the go-to guy and having the ball in his hands every play to carry the team and get those types of numbers is something that might not be looming over him like it was before. Like, after averaging almost 27 and 10 this season, leading the league in points and assists last season, and he still doesn't get voted into the All-Star game, nor does he get any of the same national media attention that other young stars get. Like, it should be a wake-up call for him at this point. Especially now with DeJounte, there's no reason for Trae to feel like he needs to reach those type of marks in order for the Hawks to win. It may look satisfying in the stat books, but it's proved to get ignored every time now if the Hawks can't get over 500. So this last 23-game stretch could potentially be where we see Trae develop more as a leader. And I'll also note one thing for this season is that compared to last season, he's had a relatively high level of defensive effort, and I only expect that to become more consistent from this point on, so credit to Trae for that. But as we transition to offense, which has been a bit underwhelming amidst the Hawks being last in the league in passes, players being ice cold from beyond the arc, and on occasion just plain stagnance, this is where I support the decision to move on from Nate McMillan. In a lot of the half-court sets and actions that the Hawks would run under Nate, it was far too easy for the defense to discern which player the Hawks were trying to play through, which players were being used just as role players, just going through the motions, and what exactly in the defense the Hawks were trying to attack to create an advantage. So much of creating those advantages was reliant on either Trae or DeJounte. And let's say after running an on-ball action, if they could not directly create a scoring opportunity for themselves or a teammate, it just became a free-for-all. Like either Trae or DeJounte would settle for an ISO, or they'd reset and try to run a pick and roll, kick it to the other, maybe do the same thing, or to a teammate to chuck up a shot at the end of the shot clock. Like, other than those two and Bogey, the Hawks never consistently have run sets through any other player until, like, less than a month ago, DeAndre Hunter actually started getting featured a bit more. But the key is that everyone on the court needs to be perceived as a threat in some sort of way, and that wasn't the case in McMillan's offense. The Hawks would slowly set up that one action that they run, but rarely did you ever see any other actions flow smoothly off of it. Because this really wasn't a modern style NBA system that dynamically incorporated the combination of several different actions in a quick hitting fashion. And that goes back into the idea of maximizing talent, because you had 80% of the team being used as floor spacers or one-time screeners, and instead, like, you could have something that is using all five guys as vital and active contributions to the playmaking offense to challenge the defense. It's exactly why the Hawks struggled so much with switch-heavy teams, because you had two guys on the entire team that were responsible for creating all of the advantages. And flaws in the system are absolutely evident in the stat books. The Hawks again sit last in the league in total passes and passes per game, but also in secondary assists, which is a pass leading to an assist, and secondary assists per game. And you could see it too if you watched the games. It was more than just the lack of variety with the inbound plays. The players would take turns shooting the buzzer beater at the end of quarters, which oftentimes would just be like a double team contested fadeaway or a pass to someone who didn't have enough time to get a shot up. We could go back to a specific example, the Golden State loss in double overtime. And at the end of regulation, it just seemed Trae was foul baiting in the clutch, and maybe there wasn't an actual game plan here. And just in general, defenses get away way too easily with things like overhelping or just camping in the passing lanes, completely loading up one side, those type of things. And on top of that, possibly going back to the intensity, energy, and preparedness of the players is in regards to how rarely, or it wasn't rare, but it just wasn't enough that we saw players properly attack closeouts. They would just kind of catch the ball and stop, do nothing. And it would allow the defense to reset, and it was a big part of why the offense felt so stagnant. Over time, it grew more and more evident that the Hawks were maybe underperforming, and the amount of speculation about Nate McMillan's offensive system and its compatibility for this Atlanta Hawks roster and just the modern NBA, that had just started increasing rapidly all season. So sometime in mid-January, I conducted a little experiment with the artificial intelligence program ChatGPT. And the results actually kind of blew my mind. Essentially, the data that ChatGPT is programmed with is only as recent as 2021. Which means its most current NBA knowledge has DeJounte Murray in a Spurs uniform and the Hawks at some point around the Eastern Conference Finals run. I wanted to see how much it could speculate about how the Hawks' playstyle would be with DeJounte Murray on the team, since it's in a world where DeJounte Murray is not on the team. So here's what I put as my initial prompt. I wrote, based on your knowledge about the Hawks, who still have Trae Young, DeAndre Hunter, Clint Capella, yada, 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 and about DeJounte Murray up until 2021, what could you speculate about maximizing the talent of each player on that team if they were to add DeJounte Murray? For example, do you think a fast-paced style of play or a slower play style like the one that is currently implemented by Coach Nate McMillan would be a better suit for the team? Now, what followed this was the AI first imagining the fast-paced run-and-gun type offense like we did coming into this season. And then as I started asking it more about the detriments of a slow-paced offense for this team, this is where it started becoming scarily accurate to a lot of the inconsistencies and issues that the Hawks offense actually had this season. And I'll post the entire thread on my Twitter at JackTresh and on the Hawksology Instagram page, but just a quick snippet of it, which reads, it was one of the responses from the AI that said, in a slow-paced offensive system, the ball and player movement may be limited, leading to more isolation plays and stagnant offense. This can result in sets such as repetitive pick and rolls with limited player movement, predictable off-ball screens, and limited player and ball movement in the half court. Yeah, some really crazy stuff that this is an AI with outdated knowledge, and still it's able to give us speculations that are far more accurate than the observations of actual media personalities and also toxic Twitter personalities who claim they watch every single game. Like, well, does that really count if you have your head buried in a trade machine all game? Anyway, with all of what we covered, it just points to how the talent of this Hawks roster was not being maximized, and so it was time to make a change to fix that issue. The way the players are evaluated and by the media and the fans definitely would change if the Hawks were able to integrate a more dynamic offensive system, especially under a coach like Quinn Snyder, who reportedly is the front runner head coach candidate that the Hawks are closing in on. Utah, while Quinn Snyder was there, was always one of the better offensive teams in the league and even held that 1 seed and played just very competitively through the bulk of the regular season. In terms of the offense that Quinn Snyder could integrate for this Hawks team, you can definitely expect much more contribution and fluent integration of movement, screening, and just general activity for the players off the ball to become a bigger part of the playmaking. And all of that while not completely abandoning the pick and roll. The pick and roll would probably become more efficient depending on the different actions Snyder could use to set it up. I think it's going to be closer to what everyone expected this Hawks team to look like coming into this season. Before all of the negativity and just controversy that was brought about by the limited amount of actions successfully integrated out of Nate McMillan's spread offense. But more on the coaching situation as the updates come. But it's great to be back, y'all, and I'm really excited to be starting up Hawksology again. I appreciate every one of y'all for sticking with me while I just randomly disappeared. And we got some great stuff coming up, so make sure to follow me on Twitter. And as always, thank you guys for watching, and we'll catch you next time.